Oh, the view is excellent. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, there you go.
Okay. We're at like 6:30, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thanks everyone for showing up.
Oh, what do you want? Oh, that's probably where I played.
You need a louder voice.
I'm like a kindergarten teacher. Thanks everyone for coming out to our December meetup. This has been a long time in the making. This was supposed to be our September meetup, and then our October meetup. But I'm really, really happy to be able to pull it together for December, and really, really happy to be able to host it in this gorgeous space, courtesy of Worcester Polytechnic. Thank you so much. Really beautiful, and we're not even, because it's nighttime, we're not even seeing the water and all the great stuff that's going on right outside the window there. But I hope to be back here at some point, and we're going to work with WPI on that. And this is a great space, and thank you so much to them for hosting. A couple housekeeping items. Coming up on the end of the year, we're working on putting together a full schedule of events, monthly events for 2019. One of our goals is to mix it up a little bit with in-town 128, maybe even 495 if we have a density of members there. So just keep an eye on your inbox. I'm going to be sending out a little survey that, among other things, asks you, like, what is your zip code, so that we can get an idea of our 2,400 odd members, where people are, and then maybe start to move these around and place them where we have a density amount. The other one is, of course, well, a couple things. If you have ideas for talks, either talks that you've given, talks somebody in your organization has given, things that you've read about that you would like this group to delve into, use the meetup or shoot me a line personally. You can just do paul@securityofthings.com. And let me know. We want new ideas. We want good ideas for speakers. We saw somebody at a conference or an event in town you think is really smart on any of the range of issues that we talk about, from legal policy to hardware and software platforms to implementation, what have you. We really run the gamut in this group. So all of that is germane and game. Let us know. And if your organization or company might be interested in sponsoring this meetup, hosting, buying food, sponsoring our streaming, our webcasting, also paul@securityofthings.com. We're definitely looking for companies that might be doing that. The value add for them, obviously, is recruiting, for one, 2,400 members, a lot of technical folks, visibility, chance to kind of have your folks and thought leaders be part of the conversation. So we saw Stanley Black and Beckers posted last month. We'll be doing more stuff with them. And without further ado, I'm going to hand the mic over to Kurt, who's going to talk about WPI and the great program that you guys have around technology and cyber.
Thank you.
We've run into each other at a bunch of events.
Right. Paul and I met at the Advanced Cybersecurity Center meeting.
Yes.
And Paul was telling me, I think it was Akamai was not able to do this any longer. And so I said, gee, we have a seaport facility, maybe we could host it. And so Paul said, well, where is it? And I said, can you look out the window? And if you see the green building, we're on that ground floor.
Yeah.
So that ACSC meeting was right across
right at the Federal Reserve.
the channel here at the Federal Reserve Bank Boston building. So
you want me to drive? I can drive your slide if you want.
that'd be great. And if there's a way to minimize this guy, I don't know if there's a way to minimize it.
Yes.
That'd be great. Yes. I'll stand on this side. Okay.
Is that good?
Yeah. So
or do you
let's
want me
move
to?
on.
Yeah.
It will go quick. This is less than 10 minutes. Next slide.
Sorry.
Okay. So this is about WPI. WPI is a real school with a real campus in Worcester, Massachusetts. Worcester does exist. Some people, I know I grew up inside of 128, right? So Boston, 128, the clip starts, right? 495, the abyss, right? Well, there's life in the abyss. Worcester's one of them. It's about an hour if you're going in the opposite direction from traffic. It can be quite a bit longer otherwise. Let's advance one, Paul. Yeah, so what is WPI? Fully accredited, nonprofit, highly ranked. So we rank out in the top 50 or 60 in the nation for research universities. When rankings are done by value-added education in terms of your lifetime pay impact, it's an engineering and science school. We do very, very well. We're in the top 20 in the nation time and time again. But the school is a nonprofit founded in 1865 to teach and to advance the state of knowledge. So learning, research and education. And so we're happy to host this sort of event because it's education. And so we're very pleased to see this. Yeah, I'm going to talk about three things: research, education, and institutional engagement. Research. Rich cybersecurity culture. We have an inclusive environment. There's 10 faculty members that do just cybersecurity. That's their research interest. Move forward, Paul. And thank you. Yeah. These are the research areas. So this gives you an idea of what 10 faculty can be up to. All kinds of topics funded by a lot of different sources, frequently funded by the U.S. government of some sort. And so you'll see them all here. Next one. And of course, with all this research activity, we did apply and get recognition as a national security agency, Department of Homeland Security Center of Excellence in Research. I say that a little bit last because there's about 50 universities that have that distinction, but we're one of them. Next. Education. So we have a number of educational programs that touch on cybersecurity, and they range really from what I would call pure technical, which is 10 electrical engineering courses that are primarily concerned with cryptography. WPI's got a 20-plus year history in crypto. We often are highly cited in published work and so on. So the research in crypto is a big deal at WPI. I think there's something like 15 PhD candidates in crypto right now. So just an idea. Then in our other programs, we do a mix of technical and business because here we're interested in people thinking about cybersecurity as a technical challenge, like software security analysis or digital forensics, intrusion detection. There's technical challenges, but it all fits in the context of an overall business picture. That's our programs in computer science. We have an online certificate. There's data science. Those tend to mix. And finally, on the business side, we have graduate specialization. We teach IT. There's IT master in IT management, that sort of thing. I do a little of that myself. I teach in our business school. I teach at the graduate level around risk management. Cyber is put in the context of all the risks that you have to manage. Next one, Paul. Also, on the educational front, we do customized programs specific to companies, and this is a build flow, so we'll just step through all three here. And what you'll see is we've taught specific course on standards in the power industry for a company that then created an expertise center and go out and help utilities with power cybersecurity. We taught cloud security for a nearby global bank here in Boston, and we taught program protection. So what that is thinking about the life of software, both as a electronic set of standards, but also on the hardware it's on. And this gets into things like missile technology or aircraft technology from a defense perspective, where you're very worried about cradle to grave. You wouldn't want somebody going rummaging around in the trash and finding, you know, the latest control system for your Predator drone. So the military looks at the whole program. Next slide, please. Institutional engagement. So what this is WPI seeks to partner with organizations. We look to do several things. Organizations come to us and say, hey, we want to hire your grads. And so we create a pipeline of well-educated students, programs I just mentioned. Also, WPI features theory and practice as an educational philosophy. Practice part includes projects, put it all together, apply what you learn. The projects often are sponsored at companies. And in my mind, the best projects for the students and the company are one where the student test drives the company and the company test drives the student, and they get something productive done. Next one, Paul. Questions? Any questions for me? Okay, hearing none. So let's advance it one there, Paul. So I have an ask for the people here. So if and when you tweet tonight, which I might be already late. Next one, Paul. If you include hashtag WPIC4, here's what happens. The president of WPI, Dr. Laurie Leshan, sees that this facility is getting used. And so we have a mutual interest in seeing Laurie learn that this facility is getting used. So if you can hashtag WPIC4 on your tweets, that's helpful. And with that, thank you.
And we will absolutely do that.
Okay, thank you very much.
And this is you.
Yeah. Well, those are just extra slides. We don't need more about Mike.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul.
Mike. And we will do this again.
Okay.
Okay. Just to the left of that second screen. Huh? Further up to the right. There's a grid next to it. Sorry. Yeah, there we go. Yep. Okay. Let me grab our toggle speaker. Top right. Next to exit full screen. Oh, you're right. Oh, okay. And with that, I am going to hand over to our main speaker for the evening. Well, we've actually got a couple speakers for the evening. One is, as I said, Billy Rios, who is going to be reprising his When IoT Attacks presentation, which is talking about medical device security. Billy's one of the top medical device security researchers in the country. And actually, a special bonus guest, we have Joshua Corman from PTC, who's Chief Security Officer at PTC, who's also going to be streaming in and talking to us just about, we're going to talk about kind of the bigger picture around medical device security, security in healthcare. Josh has done a tremendous amount of work on the public policy front down in DC, working on issues related to medical device cybersecurity. Started this group, Eye on the Cavalry, that has been working very hard on it. So we've got actually two speakers. And now, Billy, can we hear you?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
I can hear you via this, but we're going to need to let me just figure out how we get you on the. I'm sorry, guys. Figure out how we get you on the overhead speaker.
Maybe I could try just joining the computer audio real quick and see if that helps. One sec.
Okay, yeah. Get that one. Try now. Huh? Yeah, I know. We want to make sure his voice comes out of it.
Want me to turn it on?
Oh, yeah. Hey, Billy?
Lights on now.
Is that better?
Try
Can you guys hear me?
I can hear you, but
Can you guys hear me?
You're on your laptop, change the audio output. Okay. Where do I do that? Huh? Where are we talking here? Oh, here, right here. Okay. There we go. Hey, Billy, do you want to try now?
Yeah, how's it now?
Ah, excellent. All right. Here, and I'm going to flip the camera around so you can see your audience. I don't know if that would help you.
Okay, yeah, that's great.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, everybody, for helping me troubleshoot Zoom. Which? Yeah, the chat window. Yeah. Yes. Good. Billy, can you see them?
I sure can. I can see you guys.
Great. And we see your screen. We see when IoT attacks. So that's good. And let me just see. Is that better? Try now. Hey, Billy.
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yep.
Perfect.
Still a little loud.
Still a little loud. Okay, that's a good problem to have. Okay, now try it again, Billy.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Billy's naturally loud. Just get used to it.
I
Okay.
am, yeah.
That was Josh chirping in there. Okay, Josh, you're with us too. Okay, great. Billy, thank you so much for joining us here in snowy Boston. Well, we're not snowy, but it's kind of cold and dreary. And welcome to Boston Security Things Meetup. It's great to have you.
Perfect. Thanks for having me. I can actually see outside the window over there. I see some water. It looks like a pretty awesome venue you guys have. So thanks for joining.
Thanks for joining us. I leave it to you to introduce yourself, tell the group a little bit about yourself, and also, talk about your talk.
Yeah, definitely. I'll go ahead and get started. We have a couple intro slides here, and that's me right there. Had a chance to work at a couple different places, and the research that we're going to show here actually is on connected devices, not medical devices, so it kind of fits more into the security of things. And I actually did this research with this gentleman here, Dr. Jonathan Butts, who I'm actually on an engagement with right now out in Ohio. And there's a lot of other folks that have contributed to research that either is directly associated with what we did or indirectly, or provided some type of insight into some technology at some point in time. And so definitely want to make sure that various people are recognized. I'm sure I'm missing someone. If I am, I didn't do that intentionally. Just let me know, and I can definitely get you added to the list here. So, when we think about what IoT is, it's the Internet of Things, according to Wikipedia, which is a pretty good source there. Especially if you donate $3, you can end their fundraising campaign. But according to Wikipedia, there's going to be maybe 26 to 30 billion devices by 2020, which is only, a year and a half away now, or a year away now. And that's like 2 to 3 devices per person, right? And so when we try to define what IoT really is, really it's the interconnection of uniquely identifiable embedded computing devices within the internet infrastructure. So I kind of highlighted or bolded the kind of key pieces there: interconnection, embedded computing devices, internet, right? So that's kind of interesting. And so when we think about those devices that are connected to the internet, embedded devices that are connected to the internet, and we look at those things from a traditional IT security model. We see things like confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Those are all super important things, But what we're primarily interested in, me and Jonathan, is actually the safety aspect. So when we look at some of these devices, we're really more interested in the safety aspects here. So we did a research project. We essentially had three criteria that we wanted for our research project. We wanted to look at a device, but the device had to be connected to the internet, which a lot of IoT falls into. We wanted the device to be in a public space or accessible to the general public. And then we wanted, the last piece was, if the device were to be exploited, we could actually leverage that to cause a safety issue. And so when you try to take these three criteria and put them together, it's actually pretty difficult to find something that meets all three criteria. So, for example, we could definitely find things like, SCADA that may not be necessarily connected directly to the internet that could cause harm to someone. We could find connected devices that were like, let's say, in a manufacturing floor, but that's not really a public space, right? And then there's tons of devices that are connected to the internet, but just because a device can be exploited doesn't necessarily mean that it can be leveraged to cause a safety issue. And so one of the systems that we looked at that meets all three criteria are actually car washes. And so we decided to kind of dive a little bit deeper into the security of various car washes. And when we say car washes, we're not talking about, the Boy Scout or Girl Scout troop out doing car washes by hand or with hose or something like that. We're talking about like industrial car washes, right? So these things are essentially like robots, industrial control systems that are washing your car in an automated fashion, right? So in fact, we're going to show you that the car wash systems are essentially industrial control systems, right? Which is pretty interesting, given that, if you were to find an industrial control system connected to the internet, I think that kind of raises a big red flag as far as what your security looks like. But when someone connects a car wash to the internet, no one really says anything. And so kind of the bottom line for all this is not theoretical. We did actually find a car wash system. We discovered some exploits, vulnerabilities within that car wash system. We wrote some exploits, and we can actually cause that car wash to physically attack someone, right? Cause a safety issue. And so that's how we meet all three of those criteria, right? They are on the internet, directly accessible via the internet. They are in public locations, and exploitation of these devices can certainly cause a safety issue, right? We're gonna walk you through how all that happens. And there's actually no patch for the vulnerability we discovered, which brings some really interesting questions into play, right? So when we look at things like medical, when we look at automotive, it seems like the regulators and the people who kind of manage the safety for those systems, they take it pretty seriously, right? So me and Jonathan actually had an opportunity to do some assessments against like aircraft, military and commercial aircraft, and if there were ever a flight, safety of flight issue, or if there's a crew safety issue or passenger safety issue, there's a regulator there that's standing by to kind of deal with those types of situations. But when we deal with IoT or connected things, that doesn't really exist, right? There is no regulator for car wash systems. In fact, it's my belief that there really is no incentive for IoT manufacturers to build in safety to a lot of their devices. If you look at some of the margins and some of the cost control mechanisms that are put into some of the IoT devices that we see, there's almost a disincentive to kind of build in more than absolutely needs to be there, right? And so, although I'm going to be talking about the technical pieces here, I think there's definitely a deeper kind of political and policy, just societal impacts of connecting devices like this to the internet, or just connecting them in general, where we have to think, I think, long and hard about this. So maybe we can talk about that here at the end. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the setup here, about how these types of engagements or assessments happen. So right now, currently, there really is no mechanism for researchers to safely test public safety issues without expending their own resources. So, when we talk about research like this in a public setting, this is independent research, right? No one paid us to do this. No one hired us to do this. We just decided that this was going to be a fun project. And me and Jonathan decided to spend really our own money to kind of figure this sort of stuff out. Because there really is no good, solid mechanism for researchers to kind of test these types of issues. And I think a good case study are these two guys here, right? So Dr. Charlie Miller and Chris Valasek. And if you don't know who they are, they actually did the remote exploitation of the Chrysler Jeep, right? That caused a recall of that Jeep, the Chrysler Jeeps. And so they actually published their methodology and findings in a paper. And you can actually read that paper here at this link that I provided. So I'm going to take a couple pieces from that paper and just kind of walk you through some of the things that they did, because it actually really marries up with some of the things that we saw as well. So in the paper, Charlie and Chris basically outlined some of the equipment that they had to buy. And they spent their own money buying this, right? So for example, they had to buy a micropod system. They bought a diagnostic extender. They bought a VCI system. They had a pod kit that they had to purchase. They had to purchase a Tech Authority subscription, which gave them access to certain maintenance, maintainer, and mechanic level access to various pieces of the vehicle. And if you add all that stuff up, that doesn't include the cost of vehicles and other tools. That comes to about $16,000, right? So that's not a small sum of money. In fact, if you compare that to like the quarter of tuition, room, board, books, supplies, and other expenses, like someplace like Stanford, it's about the same, right? So they essentially spent about 1/4's worth of tuition, room, board, books, supplies at a major university in order to do their research, right? And so, and they freely admit, like on page 73, that without that, they could have done the research without it, but really, the tools that required them spending this much money really sped their analysis up, right, and made it a little more meaningful. And then on page 72, they also talk about donating plasma for several weeks to finally be able to afford some of the diagnostic software. So I hope this is a joke, right? But I think it just goes on to kind of reinforce the point that some of this stuff's actually really expensive, right? And so definitely like to say thank you to Charlie and Chris. And so let's talk more about the car wash systems here. If you wanted to buy a car wash system to do research on, this is about how much it would cost you, right? There's a car wash system for sale in Texas. It's about $850,000, right? So that's because connected car wash systems are actually money generating devices, right? So people kind of view them as investments. And so for most people, including myself and Jonathan, purchasing one of these outright just isn't possible, right? So we had to go other ways. We definitely want to test against these systems. And once we find vulnerabilities, we want to actually make sure the vulnerabilities work. So the first thing that we did is we asked people if we could get the firmware for these systems. And so in 2014, we actually found someone that was willing to give us the firmware. They wanted money for it, so we paid them. And then 3 years later, we actually found an owner of a car wash system that would let us test against the actual real car wash, right? And so we had to pay him for that as well. So there was actually a car wash system that was like 3 blocks away from my house. And we couldn't test against that system, right? Because we're not authorized to test against that system. So even though it would have been nice to just kind of go up the street and do some cybersecurity testing against the car wash system three blocks away from my home, we just couldn't do it. So instead, the car wash system that we found was literally in a different state. And so we would have to fly to that state. And then we actually had to drive like 2.5 hours from the airport to get to this actual car wash system. So me and Jonathan paid about 3 visits to the car wash, testing our exploits against this live system, right? So obviously there's costs associated with that. And then of course, when you're spending weekends away from home to do testing against car wash systems, that brings some anger and annoyance from the spouses. You can't calculate those costs. And then of course we had to pay for all the car washes that we use as well, right? So, because no one's going to give us free car washes. So I'm not saying car wash owners are gold diggers, but this stuff gets kind of expensive, right? So, kind of the piece about the setup is we really need to create a mechanism for researchers to test public safety issues, right? So, because if we don't, essentially we're going to be forcing them into three different buckets. The first bucket is to just give up and say, hey, you know what? I don't have the money. I don't have the resources. I can't get the money, or I don't want to spend the money. So they're just going to give up. Number 2, they'll spend their own money, like Jonathan and I did, or like Chris and Charlie did. Or number 3, which is the worst case scenario, they'll test against live systems, unauthorized, right? So, and we've seen that happen already. And so I don't think these 3 options are any good, to be honest. So I think it would be nice if we had some type of mechanisms for researchers to test public safety issues. If there was a legitimate public safety concern or a public safety issue that they had discovered, it'd be nice if we could test and validate and figure that sort of stuff out, right? So without having to have a researcher either spend their own money or test against a live system in an unauthorized manner. So that's enough about the setup. I'm going to talk a little bit about the technology. I'm going to race through this a little bit, and then we'll talk a little bit about kind of understanding risks and things like that. So as we had said before, car wash systems are essentially industrial control systems. If you have physical access to a car wash and open up the panels, this is what you'll see, right? It's very similar to what you'll see in a manufacturing floor, ICS SCADA. It's actually very close, right? So, and if you look at some of the older systems, like what we see on the left-hand side, and compare that to what you see in the more modern systems, you'll see that over the last like 5 years or so, these systems actually have undergone a lot of change. So if you look at the controller on the left-hand side and the newer controller on the right-hand side, you'll see that there has been like a lot of advancement, a lot of connectivity that's been plugged into these car wash systems. The car wash systems do have a nice web interface. They have different levels of users that you can use, which makes things very nice and easy to use for the end users. If we take a look at some of the information that's offered to us about who the manufacturer is, what the firmware version is, what type of system it's running on, the web interfaces tells us a lot about that. So if we look at some of the options that are available in the car wash, we can configure it to send emails by pointing it to a mail server. We can set a subject tag and things like that. So that's right. Car wash can send emails, right? So it's pretty amazing. Why would a car wash need to send emails? Maybe there's a manager out there that wants to know what the daily sales report is and have that email to them every day. In fact, that's one of the features that's built into the car wash. So you can kind of understand why they would have this functionality built into it, right? Because it's pretty useful, to be honest. If you look at some of the other pages on the web interface, you'll see that the car wash is on Facebook. It's also on YouTube and LinkedIn. I can understand the emails. I don't know why the car wash system's on Facebook. I don't know why it's on YouTube or LinkedIn, right? So, but if we look at how all this stuff actually runs, this particular car wash system runs on Windows CE, WinCE, and it runs on ARM microcontroller or microprocessor. And so that's pretty interesting. And then essentially the web interface that we were just looking at, it doesn't run on an IIS web server or Apache web server or anything like that. It actually runs on something called the Intrinsic Rainbow web server. And that's all served through one DLL, RBHTTP22.dll. That's where you see that web interface. And then the actual application layer is served through something that the car wash manufacturer calls BGI, which is Binary Gateway Interface. And essentially what Binary Gateway Interface does is it maps on web server calls. So if you're browsing to the web application and kind of calling different web application endpoints, those all get mapped to some unmanaged application DLLs, ARM DLLs, which is not usual for a web application, right? So usually if you have a web application, you don't have to worry about your traditional like buffer overflows and format string issues and heap overflows and those types of things. You really have to deal more with like web application security issues. Through the use of this binary gateway interface, you actually have to worry about both now because it's mapped to unmanaged DLLs. And so here's all the DLLs that we pulled off the firmware. There's quite a few, right? And so this is the whole functionality of the car wash system here. And the way that it works is when you browse to the web page or you browse to the web interface, that call is actually going to get handled by that web server, like we said, RBHTTP22, the Intrinsic Rainbow web server. And then what the Intrinsic Rainbow web server is going to do is actually it's going to look up your role in a file called Access RBA. And so here's an example of the Access RBA file. And then essentially what it's going to do is look up your user in a user database to see whether or not you're authorized to access a particular piece of functionality or not. And so if you made a request for, let's say, reporting, it would go through this whole process and determine whether you're privileged enough to see a report. And if you are, it'll actually allow you to see the report. And if you're not, it's supposed to kind of kick you out and not allow you to see the report, right? So there are some default credentials for this car wash owner. So for example, the owner account, the default password is 12345. No one will ever guess that. But if you were to log in as an owner, you would have full control of the car wash. That includes getting free car washes. So there's another set of credentials in there called PDQ Engineering. This is really kind of a built-in engineering account. The default password for that is 83340. And if you were to log in with that user account, you'd have engineering control, but you wouldn't have access to like sales, or you couldn't issue yourself free car washes. So if someone were to log in with any one of these credentials, they could actually cause a safety issue. But we're going to assume that the car wash owner is diligent when it comes to cybersecurity, and they've changed these default credentials, right? So because everyone should do that, right? And so we want to look at the various users that are accessible in the actual car wash system. There's quite a few. And then we want to look at how the car wash actually works, right? And so earlier we had mentioned that these car wash systems are essentially industrial control systems. And if you look at how the actual car wash system is doing communications amongst the various components, you'll see that that is indeed true, right? So if you look at the protocol that it's using to communicate from the bridge nodes to the modules, it's actually using Modbus. Modbus is an extremely common a protocol that's found extremely commonly in industrial control system environments, right? SCADA environments, things like that. In fact, if you take a closer look, you'll see that the drive type there, it says Altivar. We'll just kind of zoom in on there. You see Modbus address 3, drive type Altivar. For those of you that don't know what an Altivar is it's a variable rate drive, right? So this is essentially like a PLC, something that you would definitely find in a manufacturing floor or an ICS environment. So when we say that a car wash system is essentially an industrial control system, it actually really is, right? All the components that you see inside of a typical industrial control system environment, it's in the car wash, right? So, and then if you're reverse engineering the actual application functionality for the car wash systems, there's a ton of DLLs. And so, but it really comes down to these three. So there's an XM_users DLL. That contains all the functions that you need to read and edit user settings. And then there's a specconfig.dll, which contains all the functions you need to alter the configuration of the system. And then the last piece is the webmki.dll, which contains functions to actually move the components within the system. And so we'll come back to these 3 DLLs here in a second. But if you're doing reverse engineering of this car wash system, these are probably the 3 most important DLLs. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the exploits here. And so really what it comes down to is because we assume that the owners have reset the passwords to something that's not default, we have to find a way to get access to the actual car wash system and interact with it in a way to where the car wash thinks that we're authorized to do things. And so if we reverse engineer the authentication mechanisms inside the car wash system, we essentially see this like pseudocode where it sets the authentication level to owner, and then it enters try catch block, and inside the try block, it attempts the authentication routine where it checks your username and password. And then if there's a failure or something like that, and it jumps to the catch block essentially just has a continue. And so the way that it actually does authentication is it takes an authorization header when you make a web request to it. And so the way HTTP authentication headers or authorization headers work is that you have an authorization header piece, and then after the authorization header, you have a scheme. And then after the scheme, you have a base64 encoded username and password, right? If you decide to use the basic scheme, which is what we're doing here. And so if we create an invalid authorization header, like let's say we pass in an invalid scheme and an invalid base64 encoded value, this is what happens. The authentication level will get set to owner, which is the highest level of authentication that you can have. It'll enter this try catch block and attempt to do the authentication routine. The authentication routine will actually cause an exception, and the exception will jump into the catch block, and the catch block will just continue. And because at the end of the authentication routine, it's supposed to set the authentication level back to something that's not privileged, that actually never happens because of this try catch block. We have a continue. And so if we pass an invalid authorization header, we actually get to authenticate as owner, right? So knowing this, we can actually write some Python and take advantage of this, right? So we can just create a URL lib2 request to the car wash system, pass it an authorization header, and then just pass it an invalid scheme with an invalid base64 encoded value. And that'll make it so where we can make any request we want to the car wash with the privileges of owner, even though we don't know the owner's password. So this is the authentication bypass. It's pretty neat. And then once we are able to actually make the request to the system as an owner, what we can actually do is call this XM users DLL. And if you remember from earlier, the XM users DLL actually has all the functions to interact with existing users on the system. So in this case, what we're going to do is actually query the owner account inside of the car wash and read back the owner's actual password. So we can make one request with an invalid authorization header and then use that one request to actually read the password, the real owner's password to the car wash system, or anyone's password, to be honest, but the owner has the highest level of privilege. So, and then, so now we're in, right? So we've used an exploit to bypass the authentication. We used the authentication bypass to get the actual owner's password, and now we can just log in as the owner, right? So now we have full control of the car wash. And so the next step for us is to identify the hardware safety mechanisms. And so what do I mean by hardware safety mechanisms? What I mean by hardware safety mechanisms are things like this. So if we move this trolley all the way to the right or to the left, there's actually metal stoppers that stop the trolley from falling off the top bridge, is what they call it. So falling off the car wash, basically, right? And so that is a physical safety mechanism. Those metal stoppers at the end of the trolley or at the end of the bridge, those are physical safety mechanisms. It's literally a metal block that's stopping the car wash from traversing too far to the right or to the left, right? We want to identify these physical safety mechanisms. And I'll tell you why we want to do that. Because after we've identified the physical safety mechanisms, we want to identify what we call the software safety mechanisms. And I'll show you an example of a software safety mechanism here. So if you look at the top left-hand corner, we have a picture of the car wash bay door. And for this particular car wash system, the bay door is actually part of the car wash. And so if you want to close the bay door, for example, what you would do is from the cloud, from your laptop through the internet, you would issue the close the door command to what they call the conductor, which is kind of the brains of the car wash, right? Which is what you're interacting with through those web APIs. And so, but before the conductor allows the door to close, what it actually does is it queries a variety of sensors and says, hey, I need you to provide me some status or provide me some values from this particular sensor. And in this case, what will happen is the conductor will say, hey, if the door sensor tells me that the door pathway is clear, I'll allow the door to close, right? If the conductor determines that the pathway for the door is not clear based on the sensor input that it's gotten, it's going to say, hey, you know what? I'm not going to close the door. I'm going to keep the door open, right? And so this whole process that we just walked through, this is actually a software safety mechanism, right? That's not a hardware safety mechanism. There's not like a metal stopper that prevents the door from closing, right? Basically what we have is software that someone wrote that has criteria, and if the criteria is met, we can actually cause the door to close even if the pathway is not clear, right? So if we have an exploit that causes the conductor to ignore the sensor, we will defeat that software safety mechanism, right? And so this is the important distinction here. Between the hardware safety mechanisms and the software safety mechanisms, right? Because what we're going to do if we want to affect or if we want to cause a safety mechanism is we're probably going to stay away from the hardware safety mechanisms and we're going to target the software safety mechanisms, right? I'm not saying that you can't defeat the hardware safety mechanisms, but typically speaking, defeating the hardware safety mechanisms is going to be harder than defeating the software safety mechanisms, and you're limited by a variety of other factors. For the software safety mechanisms, we know that if we can have a software exploit, the software exploit can defeat the software safety mechanism. And so I'm going to show you a video here. So hopefully it streams well. This is us exploiting the car wash system here. Let's see. Let me pull the video up here and I'll share it with you guys. Okay, so give me 1 second. We don't really need sound for this, but okay, let me see. All right, so I don't want to sign in for that. All right, can you guys see that here? You can see like a dumpster and some tires.
Yep, we can.
Perfect. Okay, I'm going to play this here. So, I mean, you know it's a reputable neighborhood when your car wash system is next to a used tire shop and there's like concertina wire everywhere, right? So this is us driving into the car wash here.
Whose car is this, Billy?
It's a rental car. And we did take the insurance. So all right. So there you see the car wash system and the exploit that defeats the software safety mechanism in the car wash system, right? So this is from the internet, so because otherwise, what fun would it be, right? So let me go back to the slideshow here, the current slide. Okay, can you guys still see the slideshow here?
Yep.
Perfect. All right. So, and you know, this scenario is actually brought to people's attention in the actual technician's manual, right? Where in the technician manual, they say, hey, look, if for some reason the sensors aren't installed or something like that, you have to be really careful because otherwise the door may come down on a vehicle or person, right? And so they fully acknowledge like, hey, if that sensor value is being ignored from the conductor, or if the sensors don't even exist, right? That door is going to hit someone, or the door could hit someone, right? And so it's something that people have thought about, but it's just something that we've taken advantage of. And so how do we do that? It's basically pretty simple. When we make a request to the configuration of the device, because we're in as owner privilege, all we do is essentially tell it to just ignore the sensor values that are coming from the door eyes, right? So, and this is some Python that we would use to do that. And then once we've told it to ignore the sensor values, we just issue another command to say, hey, you know what, close the door. And so this is us kind of using the different DLLs to make the car wash ignore the sensor value and then make the car wash close the door. So the exploit that we actually wrote actually monitors the sensor to see if there's anything there first. And then if there is something there, it disables the sensor, then closes the door. So we can actually make it to where it's just automated in an automatic fashion. The door will just close onto the car. So it's kind of neat. There are some other interesting things that we wanted to try, but the owner of the car wash wouldn't let us. And so one of the things that we wanted to try that we couldn't was to actually rotate the actual arm that's doing the car wash towards the vehicle and then move the arm towards the vehicle. In fact, there is a software safety mechanism that we saw that makes it to where if you point the arch of the arm, so make it so where the arm is pointed at the vehicle, it actually won't let you move towards the vehicle. However, as we kind of said before, that is a software safety mechanism. We actually saw the code that made it to where the arch wouldn't move towards the vehicle if it was pointed at the vehicle, right? And in the technician manual, it actually tells you why they do that, right? It's like, hey, we're doing this because we don't want the car wash to spear the door or a wall or window or something like that, right? So we couldn't test this one. The car wash owner wouldn't allow us to test this one because he was pretty certain that if we did this, we would actually not only damage the vehicle, but we'd probably damage the car wash as well, right? So, but we're pretty sure we could do this one. And the reason we're sure we could do that is because that's a software safety mechanism, right? There's just code there that basically stops that from occurring, right? There's no hardware safety mechanism there. So, and at the end of the day, we know that software safety mechanisms can be defeated by software exploits, right? So we also have one more, I'll give you one more video and then we'll kind of wrap up here. So we also did another video here of like how you could actually trap someone inside of the car wash, right? So this is kind of interesting because maybe you want someone to actually get out, or you want someone to, you know, be trapped in the car wash for an extended period of time, and then they don't know what to do. And now instead of being inside of the car wash, now they're outside of the car wash or something like that, right? So if you kind of bring into to play a couple more scenarios there, right? So, and so as you can see, the car wash is kind of starting. What we're doing is we're actually going to close both of the doors while the vehicle is in the car wash. So you're going to see that happening here, right? So we're telling the door to close. It's closing, and so the front door is closed. And if I look to the back here, the back door is closed as well, right? So now you're trapped inside the car wash, right? So, and we can keep you in there for as long as we want, right? So, which is kind of interesting. And then not shown in this video, we can also manipulate the actual washer itself too, right? Like make it do tons of soap without rinsing it off and all sorts of other stuff too, right? Or maybe even position the arm in front of the car, so making it a little more hesitant to kind of leave or something like that. And so that shows us they're opening the door there. So, so there's a lot of different things you can do with these exploits, right? So not just limited to making the door slam down on the vehicle. So I thought the trapping one was kind of funny. So, some of you may be asking like, hey, you know, why are you wasting your time looking at these car washes, right? Because I think the implications of what we've shown here actually go well beyond car washes, right? So if we look at, like, say, for example, how we score some of these risks, maybe some of the current scoring systems like CVSS don't capture the real safety risks, right? And so here's an example that we give about the CVSS inadequacies when it comes to safety. In 2015, we discovered a set of exploits against the Husqvarna Symbic infusion pump. And you can look up that CVE. It's CVE 2015-3965. And if you look at the base score that's generated for that, the CVSS base score, it's actually a 7.1, which is considered high. But if you take another set of vulnerabilities, like let's say against the Pyxis supply cabinet, that's CVE 2014-5422, and you look at the CVSS V2 base score, it's actually a 9.7. And so if you think about that for a second, you can say that, hey, that score of 7.1 for the infusion pump, that can actually be used to kill someone. And then the other one, the Pyxis supply station, that can be used to steal supplies, right? And so this is kind of showing you how we have current risk scoring mechanisms, and sometimes they don't take into consideration safety effects, right? So something like CVSS may not be the best way to score a safety issue. It's definitely a good way to, kind of get a good idea as what the IT risks are, but it may not be a good way to measure what the safety risks are. And so we do have a system that considers effects. We're talking to the FDA about this type of stuff, so I'm going to skip through this here really quickly. If you're interested in the calculator, definitely let me know. We can talk more about it. But we wanted to kind of go over two things, right? So number one, there is kind of a law of cyber to physical systems that I think anyone that's developing a cyber to physical system needs to understand, right? So, and that is the mechanical functions of your system that you're building, it's only bound by the physical limits of the hardware components. So what I mean by that is, if you have a door and the door is suspended in the air and you have a cyber system that raises and lowers the door, the physical limits of what we can do as far as exploitation goes, it's only bounded by the hardware components. And so if you have a software safety mechanism that makes it so where the door doesn't close if someone's in the door's path, if we have a software exploit, we can defeat that software safety mechanism, right? So what is capable from an effect standpoint is only bounded by the hardware components, right? It's not bounded by the software components. You have to remember that. If you have a system that is capable of killing someone and you don't have other hardware components that prevent that from happening, only software safety mechanisms, those software safety mechanisms can be defeated. We're not saying that that's easy. We're not saying that it's hard. We're just saying that, it's just essentially a fact of life that if you have a software control, that software control can be defeated by a software exploit, right? So, and that's really all that I have. And so hopefully you guys found it interesting. I know that you guys are interested in security of things. And so hopefully this is right up your alley. And then for those engineers out there that are developing systems or working on connected things, hopefully there's a couple things here that you can just kind of take away and keep in the back of your mind when you're working on those things. So I don't know if there's any questions or if there's any tomatoes or spears or anything like that you want to throw at me, but I'm willing to take those now.
People in the room. No, I'm sure there are questions because we always have a lot of questions. We've also got Josh Corman. So Billy, do I have you for do I have you for more time so we could maybe do a joint?
Yeah.
You and Josh?
Yeah, totally. Yeah,
okay.
Totally. Yep.
So why don't I introduce Josh and he's going to talk, and then maybe we can just do a kind of round robin Q&A with the both of you, because I think what he's going to talk about kind of dovetails with what you're going to talk about, particularly on that kind of policy front.
Yeah, totally. Sounds good.
All right. Give me 1 second here, and I'm going to hand over to Mr. Corman.
Open the car wash bay doors, Hal.
Totally. Okay.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah. But you want to present also.
Can you see me? I'm sharing already.
Yeah, you are. Yeah. All right. Good. Let's go. You're good.
Especially because we don't want to cut into Q&A with Billy, and I'm going to tie his content with my content. I have two options. I can either give you probably the most consolidated and clear update on what the heck is happening with cyber safety and IoT policy regulation in like whatever time constraint I have, or I can summarize how I killed a few people in Arizona the last couple of days, and Billy got to watch up close in an ER hacking simulation, not actual death. They're kind of sort of related, but how much time do you want? right now.
Do you want to hear about his hacking medical devices simulation, or do you want a kind of really cogent, concise overview of the kind of state of IoT security?
I could probably do a little of both, but
Both. Yeah, both. Okay. Not surprisingly, they want both. So maybe give us a very quick tour
Sure.
overview, and then spend a little bit of time talking about the demo that you did in Arizona. It was.
Yeah. All right. Can you tell me if I need to slow down? I can see some audience stuff. So raise your hand if you love public policy, you love regulating technology. What? All right. You're all liars. I'm going to quickly go into, tell me if you can see in pre-zo mode. I'm one of the founders of IamTheCavalry.org. We started 5.5 years ago at DEF CON, the largest hacker conference in the world. You want to shrink it?
I'm just going to shrink the video inset so they don't have to.
Okay.
You're good.
I'm also, as Paul said, I'm back in the private sector after some time in a think tank, but I'm the chief security officer at PTC. We're about to move to the seaport. I'm hiring, so let me know later, unless I scare you away. One of the things that Cavalry tried to do is we said that on issues where bits and bytes meet flesh and blood, on issues of public safety, human life, and the increasingly connected Internet of Things, we really couldn't find the adults in the room. We kept looking for the people that would just go fix the problems we were bringing to them. And we got as high and deep as you can get in the intelligence community, in the White House, and Congress. And we realized that there really aren't any adults. So if you haven't heard of I Am the Cavalry, the idea was it was a personal declaration that a hacker could make to say, if no one's coming to save us, let's be the solution that we're waiting for. So we decided to be a voice of reason and technical literacy, and ambassadors and translators into safety critical industries, regulators, and stakeholders. So of the many things we published, one of them we call the 5-star cyber safety framework, or also the Hippocratic Oath for connected medical devices. They're both basically the same, but instead of giving 155 things in an ISO standard that no one can implement, or brittle and prescriptive like a PCI standard for data security, we said, let's focus on like terraforming, going from complete ignorance and apathy towards something defensible, and start the journey. So we really focus on 5 primitives, and to Billy's point that if you got software and connectivity, you're probably going to fail. All software has flaws. So we said all systems fail. You should be able to have a ready posture towards failure across 5 dimensions. Basically, tell your customers how you avoid failure, how you take help avoiding failure without suing the helper, how you capture, study, and learn from failure, contain and isolate failure, and respond against future failure. And there's different flowery language for the different frameworks we did that were industry specific. But if you think of those 5 primitives, it's really like, do you have a secure SDL program? Do you have a coordinated vulnerability disclosure program, accepting help from willing allies? Do you have tamper-evident, forensically sound evidence capture? Do you have some sort of fail-safe or separation of critical systems like the brakes in your car from non-critical systems like the radio that Chris and Charlie hacked in order to shut off the brakes in your car? And then can you have prompt and agile secure updates, ideally over the air? So the other things we try to do is say, instead of taking the NIST cybersecurity framework or some best practices from the private sector, for protecting confidentiality of data, we tried to abstract out a different framework and say, here's how safety critical systems are different. It's just a way to Socratically ask yourself, are my biases baked into my security advice? And typically with the enterprise, you're going to have a financially motivated adversary after the confidentiality of data, sometimes but rarely integrity. It's going to be in a layered defense strategy. There's going to be a Wintel or Windows or Unix architecture. The economics are going to be clear, and the time scales or time to live is going to be 2 to 3 years before you recycle the gear. What we try to say is with safety critical, you're going to have very different adversaries, including anything from up to a nation state down to even cyber caliphate, right? Ideological adversaries. The consequences might be loss of life or GDP hit or a national security event. The context might be migratory devices or an oil rig in the middle of the ocean, or something that just really can't be secured conventionally. Different firmware, hardware, software stack. There's no buyer, there's no seller, there's no investors. I think Paul Roberts at his first Security of Things event, we had a VC panel, and they're all like, I don't know how to invest in this space. There's no money. No one's going to pay for it. And the time scales, at least for a medical device, for example, it could take 6 or 7 years to bring a product idea to market, another 15 years in the clinical environment in the US, and then another 10 after that. So these really protracted times to live makes it really hard to do this stuff right. So in the course of those primitives, what we basically said is, on the day we launched is people will probably have to die first before we'll see, you know, meaningful reform. You saw great pioneering work from Billy Rios, and you saw some from Jay Radcliffe, and you saw Chris and Charlie hacking cars, and Dr. Kevin Fu on some of his early work, and Barnaby Jack and all these great giants that we've referred to earlier. But we kept saying, you know, none of that really matters until somebody dies. Like, what's the tipping point? And a law professor we work with, Andrea Matwishin, she said, stop waiting for like this big cyber 9/11 or cyber Pearl Harbor. It's never going to happen. It's going to be more like this photo where it's the Cuyahoga River in Ohio that caught on fire and stayed on fire. And you got to ask yourself, how do you put out a fire that's on a body of water? So this is about where the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame stands now in Cleveland. But this wasn't even the first time the river caught on fire. It burned down bridges. It burned down factories around the riverbanks. The pollution was so bad, it caught on fire about 22 times across a 70-year span before people had enough. So we'd like to think in the policymaking arena, we're going to have a series of fires, and eventually they'll say enough is enough. So I think we've had them. I think we're getting real close. We knew that you could hack power grids. Russia proved it. We knew that you could use Shodan to find industrial control systems naked on the internet. The Department of Justice is unsealing documents of Iranian hackers doing just that. We knew that the hospitals were incredibly underinvested, and then Hollywood Presbyterian shut down patient care for an entire week due to a single Java deserialization flaw and a single JBoss library and a single device took out the whole friggin' hospital. And then when I saw that, I said, okay, I used to be worried about Anonymous and Team Poison and different things. And while they had very few hackers, one of those hackers actually quit. UK honor student, moved out of his home in Birmingham, UK, took his punk rock Anglo-Saxon wife and newborn child to Raqqa, Syria, and he founded the Cyber Caliphate and recruited and trained people to use social media for propaganda, but also script kiddie tools like Shodan and Kali Linux and Poison Ivy and really easy low-hanging fruit and to hurt the infidels. He was later killed with a drone strike, but I kind of asked myself, in fact, there's a fantastic documentary on him, but I said, if an accident can take out a single hospital, what could Trick do? Trick was his handle. And I'm not comforted by those answers. So in a congressional task force, we pushed really, really hard on how prone healthcare cybersecurity is. I'm not going to walk you through all these, but that particular catalytic moment took myself and Bo Woods we were taken aback. We took about a 2-year break from our private sector jobs and went into a public policy think tank called Atlantic Council to drive the first and only cyber safety initiative for an international policy push. We thought we'd tackle 2 or 3 things, like some reform on FDA to help capitalize on the good work Billy had done and is still doing, Jay Radcliffe and a few others. We thought maybe we could make cars a tad safer, and we had a push to try to get coordinated vulnerability disclosures promoted by the federal government through the Commerce Department. In that instinct to go do a surge, we actually had 18 first-of-a-kind policies in about a year. I'm not going to take you through all of them, but it's pretty far-reaching domestically and internationally. So I'm going to give you a couple highlights in a big hurry here. And then even since then, since I started making these slides, these ones with stars just updated. They're on their 2nd generation of advancement on some pretty cool things based along those primitives. So the Food and Drug Administration, we kind of missed the window to say what has to happen before you bring a new device to market. But we got them to add retroactively some pretty clever hacking phrases. They basically said, you don't have to have a coordinated, sorry for the dogs for a sec. We said you don't have to have a coordinated disclosure program, but if you have one and you can fix your issue within 30 or 60 days, then you don't have to get a recall. So it became an incredibly good incentive for medical device makers to add a coordinated disclosure program to not sue people. The second thing we pushed was a similar set of principles in the Department of Homeland Security. Said, hey, we want in on the action. We do a lot of safety critical, cyber physical, industrial control systems. And they harvested out a paper of 6 strategic principles for securing safety critical IoT, including things like software bill of materials, patchability, and the like. We tried to do the same with the Department of Transportation for cars, but they were a little more stubborn than the FDA, and they're still pretty far behind. But Congress got involved and said, hey, we like what FDA's done with the cavalry and with the hacker community. You need to do the same. So they have like maybe a half-hearted approximation of what FDA's been doing. Department of Commerce quickly became a friend because they use voluntary best practices instead of heavy hand of government regulation. And the private sector tends to get more engaged. So what we did is we wrote basically a paint by numbers coordinated vulnerability disclosure template that can allow you in a matter of just a few weeks. It took me about 3 weeks to launch my own. to get through your general counsel with a really simple, high-level welcome mat that says, we won't sue researchers acting in good faith as long as you follow these simple guidelines. And it's got the stamp of approval from the U.S. government, so it's taken the stigma out of the idea that hackers equal criminals. A bunch of us also worked on a presidential commission at the end of the Obama administration, which pushed a lot of principles, but the two that are pretty interesting for IoT is that they now recognize that, one second. Oh. Yeah, they now recognize that IoT has the ability to cost public safety human life, and they're starting to push back on the notion that software should never have liability, which is really big game changer and potentially could be done very badly. So they wanted a thoughtful analysis of the state of the law with regards to software liability and harms caused by software. Because to Billy's point, it may start with software flaw, but it ends in a physical harm. And then the more interesting one is the notion of investigations create consumer labeling to dampen information asymmetry. That could be some things like you're going to see shortly for software bill of materials. It could be a nutrition label. It could be a guarantee that this device is patchable and for how many years we commit to doing so. After the switch over to the new president, the White House put out a fairly clueful presidential executive order on cybersecurity. Among many things, I like to call out two. They're taking on the chin that the executive branch for too long has accepted antiquated and difficult to defend legacy IoT. But also the second one's probably most important, which is known but unmitigated vulnerabilities are among the greatest threats faced by the executive branch. And this includes operating systems past end of life. This was really a punch in the throat to things like Windows XP, which is not only end of life, but Windows Vista is as well. Windows 7 is also now an extended lifetime support. So we're on some really, really ancient stuff, and we shouldn't be surprised when we're picked clean. But the real game changer, I think, in the Cuyahoga River fires, the cyber Cuyahoga, is the Mirai botnet really catalyzed political will. So that botnet was a bunch of these IoT cameras for about $100 a pop, and three defining characteristics allowed them to be harnessed together to a botnet bigger than even my old employer Akamai really wanted to handle or could handle. And this botnet took down the internet for a day, right around the election. So the three defining characteristics behind the Mirai botnet were, number one, an internet connection, as Billy was highlighting. Number two, a fixed hard-coded password that allowed it to be easily harvested. And number three, they were unpatchable and therefore unremediatable. So that deadly combination of internet-exposed, hard-coded credentials and unpatchable essentially is the cyber asbestos or the lawn darts of the internet, where it's just unsafe at any speed and it's indefensible. And we really don't have a good solution to it. That particular botnet was 1/20th of its total membership that was used in the attack, and only 1/20th of its attack capacity in those nodes. So a 20th of a 20th was bigger than most of us could handle. We wove a lot of that stuff in the healthcare industry cybersecurity task force report. I could do a whole presentation on this one graphic, but the basic idea is 85% of our hospitals don't have a single security person on staff. They're defending Windows XP that's over-connected to each other and the outside world, such that a single flaw in a single device can take out patient care, as we've seen done many times since. And thanks to some research done by Billy and others on a particular device, we know that a device could have as many as 1,400 or more CVEs inside of it. And while not all of those 1,400 are exploitable, it takes one to take out patient care, as we saw with Hollywood Presbyterian. So as we're publishing this, as the ink is drying, on the printouts, WannaCry, our worst nightmare, happened on Mother's Day weekend, and Bo and myself had to work pretty much without sleep for 7 days straight because 41% of the UK hospitals shut down patient care for the whole country. And that included urgent care facilities, like all 4 of their critical care facilities in the city of London, and all of their stroke trauma centers, in which you have about 3 to 4 hours to save any brain tissue. So where time matters the most, this particular attack was devastating, and we thought it was going to actually turn to the U.S. The U.S. got quite lucky. But just a few weeks later, as we're reeling from the potential harm that could have happened, the largest attack in history happened, which is the NotPetya attack from Russia against Ukraine. But in unintended accidental damage to Maersk global shipping, 20% of the global shipping was interrupted. Merck Pharmaceutical, which is a designated U.S. critical infrastructure and therefore a target that could qualify as an act of war, this did $870 million of damage to Merck alone. So this particular attack has done more financial damage than a hurricane. It's a real game changer and a fantastic article by Andy Greenberg. Almost reads like a spy thriller, but it's all true. And when you have these catalytic events like the trinity of Mirai, WannaCry, and NotPetya, it's actually galvanized even more activity out of these last ones, which I'll touch on last. There was already a bill in the works to respond to Mirai called the Internet of Things Cybersecurity Improvement Act, bipartisan in the Senate. In fact, today, the House bill companion was announced by Robin Kelly, Democrat of Illinois. But basically it said, if you want to sell IoT to the government, you have to do 5 things. These devices must be patchable. They should be free of known vulnerabilities. You're going to hear that term known vulnerabilities come up a lot. Or you have to declare the vulnerabilities you have. Number 3, they should not have hard-coded passwords or fixed credentials. Number 4, they should have standards-based crypto and communication protocols or declare when you're not. And number 5 is you should have a coordinated vulnerability disclosure program offering safe harbor to researchers acting in good faith. The internal debate in the US has really winnowed it down to just 3 things, which is be patchable, have a disclosure program, and avoid fixed credentials. The House bill that I was just referring to, we did a testimony on it, which got kind of feisty with the Chamber of Commerce, trying to argue why you might someday want a hard-coded password and getting called out for it by the chairman. But possibly most important game changer of the year was out of our healthcare security task force, the 115 recommendations they made. One of them was the one I fought the hardest for, which is I wanted to see a software bill of materials or ingredients list for all medical technologies, such that if Hollywood Presbyterian had been alerted that there was a JBoss flaw, they had absolutely no idea in the thousands of devices they had if they were affected and where they were affected. So a simple ingredients list might have shortlisted, here's the 3 devices we have to patch or take offline. So the Congressional Oversight Committee called House Energy and Commerce said, we really love this, go do it. And that was last Thanksgiving. And over the course of the intervening 12 months, there's been aggressive action on 2 fronts. Number 1, the U.S. Commerce Department said, hey, we know this is going to come for healthcare. HHS is working on it. Let's make sure it's evergreen and works for all software and all IoT. So on July 19th, there was a multi-stakeholder kickoff. I'm running one of the working groups, but we're trying to develop an evergreen, internationally applicable software bill of materials standard for all software and technology such that it can inform free market choice at purchase time and do impact analysis during active attacks. The second and really acute one is that the FDA announced in their pre-market update that they expect a CBOM, or a cyber bill of materials, which includes hardware and software, and they're going to leverage the output of that NTA process. And what this will allow us to do is both enumerate all the different components in software, make sure they're free of any elective attack surface or known vulnerabilities, but also enable that impact analysis for the entire life of the device, even if the company goes out of business. So that's a huge game changer, along with a bunch of other stuff that Billy and I are pushing on pretty hard. And while the US kind of ran out of time to pass that cyber legislation for IoT, 2 interesting things happened at the last minute. The UK government wrote this thing called the Code of Practice for IoT, which includes 16 different things, but the ones they pushed the hardest, I put the box up here. No default passwords, implement a vulnerability disclosure program, keep software patchable and updated, store credentials, and communicate securely. So there's most of that Senator Warner bill is embraced in the UK government thing, which was voluntary. But shortly after launching it, their version of the NSA called GCHQ said this stuff shouldn't be mandatory. It should be mandatory. It shouldn't be voluntary. It should be mandatory for government procurement. And then separately, the 5th largest country in the world, known as California, passed a bill out of nowhere, which basically said any IoT should have sold in the state of California should have reasonable security. And reasonable might be meaningless to you, but the only thing they specifically call out is a pre-programmed password must be unique per device or be forced to be changed. So they don't want hard-coded passwords, much like the IoT bill. And then what they mean by reasonable is they want to point at some later standard which emerges, and whether that could be something as low-hanging as the OWASP top 10 for IoT that's just been coming out. Look at the number 1 issue, weak, guessable, hard-coded passwords. So number I4 for IoT, insecure, outdated components. That's the third-party open source bill of materials. So we're starting to get some convergence around those 5 primitives I started with of how to avoid failure, take help avoiding failure, capture, study, and learn from failure, prompt and agile response to failure, contain and isolate failure. And a lot of the hardcore hackers might make fun of this policy wonk stuff or say it's really basic to be patchable or it's really basic to avoid a hard-coded password. But basic is about where the best we're going to be at right now. We're really starting a journey from over-dependence and undependable things to much more tenable and defensible infrastructure. So I've recently published a paper on ptc.com/security with my CEO, kind of challenging that IoT safety is a shared responsibility from every link of that relay race, from my software to the medical devices it goes into, to the hospitals that do or don't apply the patches. And each of us have to go from a mindset of patching is once a year or never, to patching has to be prompt and agile, because the mean time to exploitation for a new flaw is measured in days or weeks. But the mean time to exploitation, remediation is often measured in months and years, and that's not good enough anymore. The cost of connectivity is that we get our act together. And to that end, I launched a coordinated vulnerability disclosure program using my own Commerce Department template. It took about 3 to 4 weeks to get through my general counsel because we made it nice and easy. And we're trying to encourage, I think we have 3 or 4 dozen safety critical sites, safety critical manufacturers who have done a similar thing in this relay race on the IamTheCavalry.org site. But the basic idea is, like, let's say a product like mine, like ThingWorks or Exida, which is in a lot of medical devices or factories, has a bug. How do I ingest that, fix it, test it, make a patch? Then how do I get one of my medical device companies to take that, apply that patch, test their new image, deliver that to their customers? How does the customer then know about that, plan it into their change management, their go live, their testing? Like, each one of these legs of the relay race could take months. But then in parallel with that, you've got like the adversary timeline, which is either they found it in the first place or they're writing script pretty quickly. And we're going to lose that race every day, twice on Tuesdays. So the game changer becomes a really aggressive adoption of coordinated disclosure programs, a whole lot more visibility up and down the supply chain, and a whole lot more nimbleness and more like a DevOps, CI/CD, continuous change and improvement mindset. And I think we can do that just by designing things differently. So I'll wrap up here with this is a ugly wrought iron fire escape that is bolted onto pretty much every building in Boston or New York City. The thing is, this happened because we had a fire in the waist shirt t-shirt factory, where everybody on the upper floors died because there was no way to get out. And after that fire with the fatalities, there was a mandate to have security built on, right? But we don't want bolted on. We want built in, right? So I defy you. Can you see the fire escape on the outside of my new headquarters that we're moving into in a month? Anybody spot it? Yeah, I can't see it either. It's a gorgeous building, maybe because we just don't care about fire safety. But the truth is, as this construction was happening, the very first thing we built was the central firewall, which is you could survive a meteor hit in that thing. If this building were to build down, it would be the last thing standing. It's the most rugged and resilient and integral part of the weight bearing of the building, where the elevators and the fire escapes go. So it's not bolted on, it's built in, which is both elegant and cheaper and smarter. And we're hoping that the next generation of industrial IoT looks a lot like that. And if you like the building, you can also come work for me. But with that, I like to say the P and the D of the physical and digital convergence of our new logo was always missing something to me. I think that what the missing piece is the safety and security. Because while physical and digital have come together, I think it's going to be safety and security that keeps them together in the face of more attacks like WannaCry, NotPetya, and the like. So that's all I prepared, but I'm hoping Billy still stuck around, and we can maybe talk about how we killed some people in Arizona, or how we're taking his awesome breaking and research and my really nauseating policy work, and we're weaponizing each other for good.
Billy, we still got you with us?
Mute button.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yeah,
I'm still here.
All right.
So much to talk about. Well, Josh, I mean, can you give us the kind of Spark Notes version of the Arizona demonstration that you did? And we should note also that you did a demonstration at the Black Hat briefings, I believe, as well, on a sort of real life simulation of cyber attack in a clinical environment. Is that right?
Yeah, so this is the second time we did it, last June, just after WannaCry. Myself, Bo Woods of IamTheCavalry, and then 2 physicians we met at DEF CON. So they're hackers and med students that are now actual board certified physicians. They wanted to do the first ever clinical hacking simulations. So where's the sharing? Just a picture. We did this thing called the Cyber Med Summit was the first one, and we just did the second one, and Billy participated on Thursday and Friday of last week. Tell me when you can see my screen.
Yep.
Okay, so what they do is doctors always drill on their off hours for exotic situations they're going to see maybe once or twice a year. The quintessential example I've been given is a pregnant woman comes into the ER and needs a defibrillator, but there's 2 heartbeats. So do you adjust for the baby or the mom? So that particular scenario is something they have to do at least once or twice a year, but they have to drill on it so that it's in muscle memory. So what they do is they know they're going to go into a test. They don't know what the test is going to throw at them. They know it's going to have an actor that presents symptoms. And then at the time they need to do invasive surgeries or something, they wheel in a very expensive lifelike surgical dummy with anatomical correctness and instrumentation and broken ribs that break. So we wrote 3 hacking scenarios last year based on real demonstrable hacks when intersected with human physiology to see if the doctors would notice, if it would affect patient care and the like. And I'm not going to play the whole thing, but just to show an example. Here's a heart patient. He's getting a shock every minute on the minute from his pacemaker. It's causing excruciating pain. I'll let you hear one scream.
Feels like my chest is going to burst. Have you ever had a pain like this before? No, please God. You got to stop it. I got a heart block.
There he goes. So he asks, am I going to die? And basically the way the heart works is hacking a pacemaker like you've seen on TV or like you've seen from even the stock short. For 96% of patients, it's just going to make them tired. It's really not life fatal. But this particular hack basically tweaked the software to deliver electroshock once a minute. And Billy's recently done some similar research after this. This was one from last year. And what that did is if you hit the heart rhythm at the wrong moment or the right moment, it'll cause a heart attack. So this patient codes at least 4 times before they decide to ultimately cut the chest open and cut out the lead wires in an active surgical field that's getting electroshock once a minute. So a pretty harrowing situation. None of the doctors for the 3 various scenarios knew they were hacked. All the patients coded at least once. And we had some pretty profound discussions afterwards. The only one I want to add now, since Billy saw it right up front, is this year we did a very different one. We basically had a stroke patient come in. And if you know anything about stroke, you have the golden hours, which is about 3 to 4 hours before there's permanent brain loss and death, sometimes death. There's 2 different types of strokes. If you do the right testing and imaging to determine which one you are, one particular category, you can give a brand new treatment, not brand new, a couple-year-old treatment that will save your brain. And time is brain. So every second you dither, you're losing brain. But that very same treatment will kill you pretty instantly. You'll bleed out if it's the wrong kind of stroke. So it's critically important to have imaging and CT scans performed before you give the one treatment or the other. And if you don't do anything, you're almost certain to have permanent brain loss or death. And then we also, while they were getting the CT scan in this particular scenario, we had another heart patient come in who needed some cath lab testing. And both of the systems were taken out by a piece of ransomware in our scenario. So neither labs could come back. So it was simply a matter of an ER doc waiting for the labs and not knowing, should I push this drug and cause a death or wait and allow for permanent brain damage? And ultimately, the outcomes were pretty sad, but a simple denial of service on imaging cost them not to administer the drug. So probably permanent comatose on the part of the stroke patient. And as a conservative maneuver, and the heart patient died from a lack of cath lab. There wasn't even time to move to another facility, assuming it wasn't ransomed, because you only have so many hours from the initial stroke through imaging, through treatment. So it was just a matter of degraded and delayed patient care can affect fatalities in a pretty profound and sobering way. So I don't know if Billy had observations as well, but we also did tabletop exercises to see what the city or healthcare system could do in the face of different extortion events. Billy?
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting in that, doctors are really problem solvers, right? It's kind of easy for us to think that doctors are just equipment operators, but they're really not, right? They're problem solvers. And these are some pretty challenging problems for them. And one of the things that we discussed was, I thought that, most of the doctors that we saw kind of working through these scenarios probably did as best as they could, given the circumstances. But when you start to multiply this by 2 patients, 5 patients, 10 patients, 100 patients, 150, that's when it starts to get really overwhelming, right? It's where if they could focus their attention, kind of deal with one problem at a time, maybe they got a fighting chance. But if this is every patient in the hospital, man, it gets overwhelming pretty quickly, right? So there's definitely a lot of different scenarios that definitely want to think about. And then one of the doctors actually even brought this up, and this might be important for folks that are doing IT for hospitals or other places. One of the doctors mentioned to us that there's a concept called the second casualty or the second death, where, you know, if a doctor is working on a patient and a decision that they made actually caused the patient to get hurt, maybe they selected the wrong drug or didn't act quickly enough or didn't do the right procedure, that actually affects the doctor as well. And so that's something that I think some of the supporting folks in hospitals or other operational environments might have to deal with at some point in time, right? Like, I can't imagine what it would feel like if you were the IT security administrator and the CT scanner got, ransomware because of some patch you forgot to apply, and that resulted in someone not getting the right stroke medicine when they should have, and they died, right? So there's definitely these secondary and tertiary effects in these different types of environments.
Yeah, and I don't want to put words in Billy's mouth, but just to connect some of his research and some of the work we've done, I think in a really powerful 1-2 alley-oop almost. Billy had done the primary research on some security flaws in a bedside infusion pump. And while this particular one was stunning for TV, the other scenario from last year that I'm most troubled by was we hacked an infusion pump and replaced the drug library to give a 3-hour dose of calcium blocker in 30 seconds. So the right drug amount way too quickly, which caused a cardiac arrest. And the physician guinea pig correctly diagnosed the problem and gave an antidote, but also used the same compromised device, which further complicated the case. And in the aftermath, when we were discussing that it was hacked, she said, "Oh my God, if I knew if it was hacked, I would have grabbed the device from the next room over," only for us to destroy her hopes and say, well, we hacked the central resource, they're all compromised. So she's like, what do we really do? Well, when Billy had found that, the FDA was, as of yet, not found their footing, and there was no recall in history. They wanted to see proof of harm. One of the things we've learned as a community is none of these devices really ever had the tamper evident logging to ever provide said proof of harm. And some of the cavalry lean in kind of gave some education and lift up. Instead of like criticizing the FDA, we kind of educated them. And as part of that education, they came back around and did the first safety communication in history, saying this device cannot be patched. There's an unmitigated pathway to harm. We recommend hospitals cease using it. And it's really the testament and power of the technical work that Billy's done, plus the empathy and ambassador work that others have done. And that kind of sent a message to the entire medical device community, like, we don't have a couple more years to figure this out. We got to do it now. And as a result of none of these devices really having the tamper evident logging, this new pre-market guidance is really that just got announced in October. It's going to have a workshop in January. And if Billy and I converge and really push these things over the finish line, a group of us are going to see most of those Hippocratic Oath principles and primitives enacted, including a whole lot more threat modeling on the devices, the ability to do actual security scanning without breaking the device, do segmentation, fail-safe mode, degraded functionality even in the face of a compromise. Some incredibly literate things from a trust relationship, going from thinking hackers were bad guys, why the heck would they ever hack a medical device, to wow, these are helpful folks trying to work, weakness out of the system, the antibodies of the medical device ecosystem, so to speak. And, we actually used Billy's scenario as part of one of these clinical hacks last year to great effect.
Let's take some questions from the audience. You want to come up here? Yeah, that way folks can hear it on the video. Or you could tell me.
Yeah, my name's John Malloy. I'm with IT cybersecurity guy. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
My question, I'm wondering if people have thought about some of these equipment that people have hacked or you can access. Maybe if you're telling the hospitals to stop using the equipment, maybe they're out there in the black market used and they're actually being hacked still because they could be in another country being used at like international hospitals, and people are still hacking into them, or they're being resold illegally, I guess. Is that something that people think about, or that's all I have?
You really want to get scared, and Billy knows this, and now a slightly larger group of people know this, but during WannaCry, 2 years after the recall, the safety communication, right when I got back from Europe from helping The Hague on the WannaCry stuff, I had to take my own 11-year-old to the emergency room. And while I realized we're going to be there all night, I went home to get some pajamas real quick. And when I came back, she was hooked up to the one device on earth I knew could kill her. Now she just had a saline drip, but it was the very model Billy had broken 2 years after the safety communication. So it's not about black market. None of the hospitals paid attention, like pretty much none of them. And then I just had some emergency surgery in the last 2 weeks, and I saw the exact same device. So we're over 3.5 years since the safety communication. And one of the reasons we did what we did in Arizona is the last mile of reform isn't so much the FDA, isn't so much the medical device makers. It's the hospitals and physicians don't yet realize how urgent this could be. So I'm sure Billy has stuff to add to that, but there's going to have a long tail of these less defensible devices. And while we're not saying throw them away, if they're still working, you could maybe isolate them or segment them. You could maybe shut off the functionality or web, remote control of some of them. Or if you're going to buy new devices, at least steer towards devices that meet that Hippocratic oath of those 5 failure preparedness modes. Like if you have a choice between a device that does have a disclosure program and a device that doesn't, drive your money towards the more defensible.
So this is Andy Brand. I'm an AWS consultant, and I sort of specialize in security. I have one question that sort of relates to something you've already talked about, which is how much of these attacks could be mitigated or prevented if the networks were properly segmented and secured. I mean, it feels like one consistent theme in every hacking scenario is that we found one vulnerability and we're able to migrate horizontally across the different systems in the network. And it would seem that if the network were properly segmented, one, you may not even be able to get to the device to hack it, and if you did, it would limit its damage. Also, if you have an estimate on how many hospitals are doing this versus not.
This being segmented your network?
Yeah.
Okay. Billy and Josh, thoughts?
Yeah, I think this is Billy. So I think that's a good question. One of the things that I'm always hesitant about is actually pushing responsibility to just one place, right? So for a medical device, for example, if a manufacturer were to come and just say, hey, look, as long as you segment your network, you're going to be okay. I kind of don't like that approach. I would hope that like the device would have enough security engineering in it to where you could put it anywhere and it would be robust against attack, right? So much like, your phone, your smartphone, right? Like, it's not like you're like, oh man, I can only, use this in my house, right? Like there's no, restriction like that on your smartphone, right? So I would hope that we could do the same with medical devices. I mean, those devices have the ability to hurt or kill you. Those should be the most secure devices in the world, right? They should be resilient enough to kind of survive any kind of network that they're connected to. They should be, right? And the danger in kind of pushing this to the hospital level is, if you're a multi-billion-dollar hospital, maybe you can do network segmentation, have a cracked security team and all that sort of stuff. But, what if you're a 10-bed hospital, right? You still need an infusion pump. What are you going to do then, right? So, so if we kind of push it to this operational level, or just say, hey, just segment or make sure the firewall is done correctly at the operational level, there's a lot of disparity between a lot of different organizations, right? I'm not saying that they should be absolved of responsibility of securing or protecting these devices, but I would like to see a lot of the effort put into the security engineering of the device. That way, regardless of what environment it ends up in, it's still okay.
Yeah, to add to that thermometer I blitz past from our task force, the two things that should give you no joy is, number one, 85% of our hospitals don't have a single security person on staff, so who's going to do that network segmentation isolation? And number two, the government passed in the push in high trust, in the push towards electronic health records, we tied reimbursement to this clause called meaningful use, which meant you couldn't get reimbursement unless you could receive and transmit electronic health records. And that caused a whole bunch of really old devices to slap together a network interface quickly and poorly, which also tends to break your ability to do network segmentation and isolation, even if you know what you're doing, because stuff just needs to be talking all the time to some arbitrary server. So it's really, really tough to do this for those two reasons.
Hi, my name is Kalatan. Thank you. Just thank you again for coming and sharing with us. My question is two parts related to the cybersecurity or the software bomb you were talking about. At what level of detail do you share about your cybersecurity or software bomb? Do you go to, for example, if you use a Linux library, do you go to that one level of library, or do you go down to all the different level of libraries that one library itself uses? And the second question is, how much do you really share of your SBOM to the public, to security organizations like information sharing organizations, about what you actually have in your bill of materials, cybersecurity bill of materials? Because by sharing it, you might be giving more a doorway for other people to look into your system.
So fair questions. I think all of your detailed answers and more can be found by either reading up or watching the videos from the NTA Software Transparency Project. I also have a working group on that. One of the common but mistaken questions is, wouldn't this help an adversary? I think is what you're getting to in your second question. For an adversary to know about how to attack Apache Struts 2, you do a Google search for file type :do or file type :action, or you can do some secure composition analysis, fingerprinting pretty easily. But it can often be hard or even illegal for a defender to do that. So what we're really looking to do is level the playing field. And the level of granularity tends to be anything from an atomic project, like a single Java project, through all of its transitive dependencies up into compound things like Struts 2 or Commons collections. And all that's specified in the NTA work. But there's lots of commercial and free tools that already do this, whether it's Black Duck or Sonatype or some of the Veracode acquisitions or SourceClear. Dependency check is an OWASP project. So there's lots of ways to do this. And it's essentially the same as a byproduct from maybe a makefile or a build server. The goal is to equip all of your upstream and downstream dependents with the information that is currently very poorly done, as opposed to give up, say, the secret recipe, right? The difference between the ingredients and the recipe.
So I got a question, maybe a final question, unless there are others. You mentioned that there's a long tail of legacy hardware and software in healthcare environments. We know that, and also that one of the challenges. So in an attack scenario, it's pretty easy to figure out if there's a ransomware infection or a denial of service attack on a hospital. So at least they'll know the origin. More dangerous, it seems to me, is the sort of Stuxnet phenomena where you have manipulated devices to simply just give out wrong information to misrepresent the state of what it is, whatever it's monitoring, and therefore you have clinicians who are responding to the wrong, data. And I guess how practically, given that we're going to have to live with legacy hardware and software that's vulnerable for years, and there is this possibility of these kind of manipulated devices, manipulated output. Is there a need to sort of train clinicians, nurses, doctors, support folks to start having that as part of their decision tree, that this device that I'm using to monitor or assess this patient may not be reliable, and maybe I need to look at doing it manually, kind of abandoning this digital device for some mechanical device, or finding a replacement device.
Yeah, the legacy part's going to be hard. I think as people like Billy find these, they will be recalled or remediated, and we're trying to make these things more tamper evident, more forensic logging, maybe pairwise observation and on-device logging for anomaly detection, for deviation. One of the attacks we did do in the hacking simulation was an integrity attack. The device was lying about the rate of output to throw off diagnosis or treatment. So when we talk about confidentiality, integrity, and availability, we usually add patient safety as a fourth one. You could argue in a tortured way it's some subset of the first three, but it's definitely gets short shrift unless you specifically call it out as a separate impact. or outcome.
Billy,
you got?
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I do. I think you kind of mentioned something here. You talked about a decision tree, and I think that's where, like, if folks start to figure that out, things get really dangerous really quickly, right? So, for example, in the simulation, I think Josh mentioned this. One of the scenarios was a stroke victim, or a stroke patient. And really, there's two ways you can go to save this person's life. One is to apply some medicine, and one is to go down a different path. And the way that they make that decision in their decision tree is to do a CT scan. And if the CT scan tells them something, they administer medicine. If the CT scan tells them something else, they go down the other treatment option, right? And so, the point that you talked about is that decision tree is really important, because if an adversary figures out what that decision tree is and where the critical decision points are being made and alters that data, that's huge, right? That is huge. And we're lucky, that takes some experience. That probably takes some understanding of what the actual procedures are, what the repercussions are, where the critical points are in the decision tree, which means that someone has done their homework. And so it requires some effort to do that. But once people start to figure that out, that's huge, right?
Does Fancy Bear have an MD on staff?
What was that?
So does Fancy Bear have an MD on staff?
Yeah, actually, it's well, Billy was talking. I remembered a second example. Jay Radcliffe also gave a presentation, and there's an open source do-it-yourself kit on GitHub for an artificial pancreas. It basically takes an insulin pump, which is an FDA-approved device that's old and hackable, and combines it with a glucose monitor, so you can get accurate real-time readings from your glucose monitoring to give a very specific instruction to the hacked old insulin pump. And there's not a single FDA-approved one. So these guys are just some, hackers do it yourself on their own bodies, but they're now sharing that code repository. And I think Jay showed that morning there were 14 of them discoverable and communicating to Shodan. So his point was, could I just make funny patterns out of their glucose levels and send command and control loops back to these humans? And we want the life-saving technology. The quality of care over human manual injections or intermittent intervals is pretty poor. So the software feedback loop, if done securely, is a really great advancement for medical progress for all these people affected by diabetes. But, injecting an off by 1 decimal point in this code repository kills all the patients, or, being able to manipulate the glucose levels from halfway around the world potentially kills these guys or deprives them of the insulin they need.
Final question.
With devices that are in the body, like the pacemaker and other devices, what have you found around the security of those? I'm sure they're not as any better than the outside ones, but as far as attack vectors and such that you were able to exploit.
Billy, you're authority on this, I think. Mute button.
Yep.
Okay, can you guys hear me? All right, we have a pretty significant legacy problem here when it comes to like embedded devices, especially implanted devices, right? So, but you have to think about the use case there, right? So like, if a person comes into ER, and they have an implanted device like a pacemaker or an insulin pump or anything, a neurostimulator, someone's probably going to want to interrogate or look at that thing pretty quickly without having to ask the patient what their password is or authenticate to it or anything like that, right? So really a lot of the devices that we're looking at that are implanted in folks really just rely on proximity, to be honest. You have to just be close enough, right? And so that's changing with some of the newer devices, but pretty much every single legacy implanted device we've seen essentially just relies on, if you can get close enough, you can actually interrogate and kind of interact with the device, right? So it gets a little tricky.
Yeah, one of these older devices had a 3-digit hard-coded universal access code, 3-digit. Some of these implantables or subcranial stimulation devices have incredibly limited battery life, so there's no way they're doing computationally intensive, crypto and secure transport layer. So there's just physical time-space constraints on a lot of the old stuff, and even the new stuff still has some of those constraints. It just becomes a harder trade-off on functionality and care versus security and safety.
And I think with that, we're going to wrap. Could I have a big hand for Billy Rios of Whitescope? We can't see you, but thank you very much, both of you guys. It was two great presentations, really wonderful Q&A, and obviously, Josh, you're actually just up in New Hampshire, so I'm sure we'll have you here in the flesh. And Billy, yes, and Billy, next time you're in Boston, we're going to have you in.
Yeah, we'll do. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. And thanks everybody for coming. Stay tuned for information on our next meeting, which will be in January. Agenda TBD. Obviously, if you got suggestions, give them to me. And review us on MeetUp. Let everyone know if you enjoyed it. Thank you very much, and thank you to Worcester Polytech for hosting in this beautiful place.